Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Anglo-Irish statesman, author, and philosopher Edmund Burke once observed, "The people never give up their liberties, but under some delusion." If he were alive today to see the UK, he'd no doubt recognize that liberty-sacrificing delusion as the property bubble. Huh, okay, what's this all about? Stacey?
Well, Max, remember in the lead up to the general election, George Osborne and David Cameron were promising the right to buy housing association properties. And it's no coincidence, I think, that that helped drive them up higher unexpectedly and in their share of the vote than what all the polls had suggested. But the first days in government, the very first day, what they do is start to roll back our liberties, more civil liberties, more surveillance, and all that stuff. So the first headline reads, "Lords vote casts doubt on Tory plans to extend right to buy. Government plans to extend the right to buy to housing association tenants face a major setback after the Lords voted in favour of a crossbench amendment to the Charities Bill, which seeks to block the measure. Peers voted 257 to 174 in favour of an amendment that seeks to ensure charities are, quote, not compelled to use or dispose of their assets in a way which is inconsistent with their charitable purposes." So these housing associations are private property. The government wanted to force these charities to disgorge these properties to the renters in those properties who were being subsidized by the taxpayer, essentially.
Yeah, so this is in the House of Lords, and they're coming up with a counter bill to try to neutralize Osborne's attempt to steal a lot of private property for his crony buddies.
Yeah, well, what they're saying is that it will dissuade their plan to force private owners to sell these properties to the renters, that these plans would dissuade benefactors in the future from donating their land. A lot of these properties, this land and property is donated to these charities.
It's an interesting contrast with, let's say, in Greece, the kleptocrats wrote a fraudulent check to the Greek people and said, "You owe us 100 billion euros," and then when they didn't pay the money that was fraudulently loaned to them, they're stealing their assets. So here in this country, Osborne uses to write a law, like Thatcher did, to write new laws to confiscate property for the crony and the kleptocrats. So it's a bit of a different theme, a variation on a theme.
Well, Thatcher had introduced the concept of right to buy, and this is why you have many of the people who are rentiers in this economy bought the right to buy properties, and those were council houses, and so they were owned by the state or the councils, and the councils were forced to sell it to the people living in it, and thus was born a class of rentier. Now, these are privately owned properties. They're privately owned by charities, and they're forcing these charities. It's like going in and forcing Greenpeace or Médecins Sans Frontières to disgorge their property and sell it to the people who work there.
Yeah, it's capitalism at the point of a gun.
Yeah.
Essentially, he's threatening, you know, they have very liberal terrorism laws, so they can threaten you with terrorism if you don't disgorge your property to Osborne, who then redistribute it to his kleptocratic friends.
Yeah, you could call it capitalism. In America, they call it communism. Say, for example, this opening of relations with Cuba, there's just been a lawsuit filed for billions of dollars from those whose property was seized by the Cuban government back in the 60s. So they're now suing the government. They might want to say, well, over in the UK, it's called capitalism.
Yeah, that's Osborne's definition of capitalism. So.
But the other interesting thing, of course, is that it's been under the Labour governments where they basically got rid of hereditary peers, and they had always sided with Conservatives and Tories. But here they note that the Commons will have to vote in favour of the amendment before it passes into law. It is the first time in modern political history that a Conservative government has not also dominated the second chamber. The House of Lords Act 1999 removed the majority of hereditary peers, many of whom were Conservative supporters. So now there are 228 members in the House of Lords who are Conservative, and 212 that are Labour, and 101 Lib Dem. So it used to be dominated by Conservatives, so they would own that House, essentially.
The first time in history.
Yeah, in modern history, yeah.
Yeah, well, this is the whole thing about so-called left in this country, is that they don't have an agenda of political policies. They just are begging for a bigger slice of the pie. They don't want to stop being poor. They want to be rich. Mm-hmm. There's a big difference. They're not interested in putting policies in place that would create equanimity throughout the economy, like going on the Monetary Policy Committee and bringing some rational thought to how interest rates are. No left-wing politician, Jeremy Corbyn or the Green Party, will ever mention that in a speech, because they're not interested in stopping poverty. They're interested in getting rich. There's a big difference.
So also we have the issue of democracy, and we've talked about this before. One person, one vote. People go out and they vote for these policies, and the surge in the support for conservatives happened because the conservatives vowed to seize this private property and give it to certain people that happen to live there in these properties. And not all, most of them are not wealthy, and in fact, almost none of them are wealthy. But the other thing that has now happened is the precarious state of the UK economy. According to Moody's, QE feeding Europe house price bubbles, says study. The European Central Bank's quantitative easing program risks fueling house price bubbles in several countries, according to new research, as investors pour cash into real estate. So Moody's, in particular, warned about Germany, Norway, and the UK. Property prices in Norway since 2010 have risen by 30%, 25% in Germany, and 15% in the UK. And about the UK in particular, they note Osborne's policies. They say Moody's Analytics said that the loan standards in Britain are still relatively loose, primarily because of the government's Help to Buy scheme, which subsidizes purchases. In particular, the number of mortgages with high loan-to-value ratios has risen sharply since the program was introduced in 2013.
Right, and the most successful economy in Europe, Germany, the house prices go down.
Well, they note that they've risen by 25%. The government itself tries to dissuade it, and they're not happy with this at all, unlike George Osborne, who wants this and seeks this and does everything to achieve this. What has happened in Germany is capital flight from Italy, from Greece, from Spain, everybody thinking that the euro is going to collapse, and what they want is have to Deutschmark should the euro collapse, which is why people are pouring money into Germany. It is not government policy, which is why they note in particular in the UK it is government policy. It is the Help to Buy scheme, the Help to Lend scheme that was supposed to go to small businesses, and instead it went almost entirely to property lending. And now the Right to Buy scheme that they want to extend to private property, seize the private property, hand it to speculators, and that is being pushed back by the House of Lords at the moment.
Right, so Germany is seeing this rise in house price as a problem.
A disaster,
yeah,
yes.
Disaster, not as a cause to celebrate.
No, because of course they don't want people to live like rentiers. They want people to create value and wealth for the economy.
Yeah, they want workers
yeah.
that go into the factory and get huge wages and huge pension benefits and great health benefits. And all those programs are in surplus in Germany. They don't want rentier, Ponzi scheme, maniacs.
Well, speaking of Ponzi schemes, part of it is here we have the policy of pushing those who are at least able to afford it onto the property market now, okay? So all the land is already owned by this massive rentier class. If you look at the Times, the Sunday Times list of the richest people in Britain, a lot of them, the British people, i.e. not the ones that are actually oligarchs from overseas, they're actually property developers in the most part. And here's the headline, remarkable headline from this past week. Property fund leaves investors with 2-year wait to get money back. A property fund run by insurance giant Aviva has suspended dealing after losing 2 of its biggest investors. Savers left in the fund, called Aviva Asia Pacific Property, now face a wait of 2 years or longer to get their money back. So these 2 huge whale investors basically represented 75% of the assets of this Aviva fund. Anybody else who followed these whales into this fund, and anybody else who follows the whales into the stock markets or the property markets or the bond markets, well, they're the ones that get left behind. They're the ones that are not allowed to exit for a year, 2 years, 3 years.
Yeah, it's like the Jamie Dimon and MF Global. Remember, they got their money out before everyone else.
Yes.
Completely illegal.
Yes.
And this, of course, is illegal, as you just described it. I was at an event last night, a political event here in London, talking about exactly what we talk about all the time on the show, and how the property markets are in a bubble and how these economy is unsustainable. And at the end of the event, a young couple comes up to me and says, we only have one question. Should we buy property? So it's in the DNA of British people. You're never going to dissuade them from, like lemmings, running off the cliff into the abyss of a property crash. That's just their destiny is to die this way.
Well, we saw that a few months ago. The biggest property developer across China dumped his entire holdings, all of them, And what happened a few months later, a few weeks later, the whole market started to crash there. In the UK, in London in particular, here's a headline regarding the property market here, which is supposed to be like total safe haven, safe deposit box, all that stuff. And if you vote Tories, prices will continue to rise. Well, highest London house prices dip. Kensington and Chelsea, Camden and Richmond fall as bottom end gets boost from first-time buyers. So some of the capital's most expensive residential areas saw house prices drop sharply this month, according to data released today, with high demand supporting the lower end of the market. In Kensington and Chelsea, London's most expensive borough to buy in, prices dropped by 7.2% from June to July, according to Rightmove. And in the poorer areas, some of the poorest sections of London, well, relative to the rest of London anyway. Prices in Greenwich and Lambeth, for example, shot up 7.9% and 7.8% respectively. So people are the first-time buyers, helped by and facilitated by the government, are being driven into the corral into which all the top end is exiting. Yeah,
it could be the beginning now of the major bear market in London property. I remember in 1990, you had a pretty severe dip in London property. People were quite annoyed. During the 2008 crisis, retailing in London came to a standstill. There was a huge crisis. All these have been met with massive money printing. But that only works if everybody is able to support everyone else's money printing. So it's a game of musical chairs. When the music stops, as Chuck Prince famously said before Citibank blew up in 2008, as long as the music keeps going, I'll keep dancing. Well, okay, the music is playing, but we hear now that in the top end of the London property market, there's indications that maybe we're at that point in history and financial history where you have a bear market. This is what happens. And so all the collateral value that these properties represent are diminished, and you have a cascading effect and a compounding effect and a chain reaction. And I would imagine the fact that China is contracting and Australia is contracting and Canada is contracting, and all these economies are now in collapse along with the commodities index, is going to make its way into this high-end London property. It's just as night follows day, as Pluto orbits around the solar system, as boy meets girl, as as it's just the way it is. I mean, but when it does fall, as predictably as it will, somebody will take the blame. It'll probably be me, and I'm waiting. I'm ready for it. We got to go.
Buy high, sell low.
All right, this is not an ad for some marijuana dispensary. Hey, stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time to return to Boulder, Colorado. Getting high in the Rockies, baby. All right, let's talk to Michael Krieger. He's the creator and editor of LibertyBlitzkrieg.com. This is part 2 of this interview. And Michael Krieger, just to pick up where we left off in the last interview, I just want to spend another 30 seconds or so on this idea that Greece was set up to fail from the beginning. It was a leveraged buyout, and now the spoils go to the victors. You got Warren Buffett's already buying an island, and they're just going to asset strip this, just like if Carl Icahn had bought Greece to asset strip, and Varoufakis and Cyprus. I don't understand. They keep trying to rationalize this according to their economics and game theory. They simply don't come out and say, we're being asset stripped by vulture capitalists from Wall Street. Can't you stop us? What's wrong with those two guys, Michael Krieger?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was reading an interview, a really good interview with Varoufakis, and he basically he made it seem like, and who knows what really went on behind the scenes, but he made it seem like he had this, he wanted to be more aggressive, that he wanted to basically issue parallel currency and basically try to Grexit as smoothly as possible. Of course, it wouldn't be smooth, but that sort of Cyprus got cold feet, and other people around Cyprus got cold feet, and they just it was something that they just weren't prepared to do. Now, from my perspective, I kind of felt like the yes vote would then allow them to do that, and that was the whole point. But it appears that it appears that within Syriza there are two factions, and one faction is scared to death. And I think that's essentially what happened. I mean, they just didn't have the courage to do it, despite the referendum, which, again, I mean, it sort of makes no sense. But here's the thing with Greece that I'm very worried about. I don't know where you stand on this, but I tweeted this out a few months ago, and I said, if Syriza fails, what you get next is not going to be warm and cuddly. right? So Syriza, a lot of people say it's radical, it's left. I mean, if Greece goes down the path it looks like it's going down, being asset stripped, Syriza failing, the next government that you get, the next popular government that comes into power is going to be truly radical and potentially very scary. So, I mean, that's where the EU is just being complete fools, because what they're doing is they're destroying Europe and leading it to war and unrest while saying that they're trying to save it. So that's my big concern for Greece if this blows up, which it looks like it is.
All right, well, you know, we're talking about Greece in terms of being a candidate for a leveraged buyout. Before the crisis, it was worth 350 billion maybe maximum. And that sounds like a lot of money, but when you consider that one stock in one day, Google, added 60 billion in its market cap, doesn't that kind of put things into perspective? There are trillions and trillions of dollars sitting on the sideline looking for opportunities like Greece. Is this market that we're seeing now with Google adding 60 billion in a day, with Facebook worth hundreds of billions of dollars, with this Apple computer now 700 billion, Carl Icahn thinks it's going to be worth over 1.2, 1.3 trillion dollars in market cap. Is this a sustainable trend, Michael Krieger?
No, I mean, I don't think it's a sustainable trend. I mean, just if you look back in history, what you see is, I mean, you see companies, they do get huge, they become massive, and then eventually you do get competition, and these companies also get lazy. And like, for example, Microsoft is a good example. I mean, they got huge, they had a monopoly, and then they just kind of faded away, and they stopped. They didn't have any innovation whatsoever. All the products that they tried to come out with, for the most part, were failures. And so it's interesting if you look at Apple, because I mean, the Mac. I still feel like Apple is riding on Steve Jobs' coattails. I mean, the guy was obviously brilliant, and what he did was, I believe, more attached to him as a person than anything else. And so I sort of wonder whether what looks to be a failure of the Apple Watch is sort of the first in a line of Apple kind of losing its edge as far as putting out products that really are game changers and innovative. That's what would happen in a market economy. Now, we both know we don't really have a market economy. So will these companies be able to sort of use their influence like too big to fail banks? So you get like too big to fail Silicon Valley sort of thing, where they become monopolies and entrenched, and then they put regulations in place to stop competition. That'll be interesting to see. Hopefully not, but because technology is still the one area that I see in America, and I see it here in Boulder, where you have a huge tech scene that's just exploding right now. That's the only area that's actually allowed to innovate in the U.S. economy, and you see what happens. Every other area is essentially like closed off, like a feudal monopoly, essentially.
Right, good point. There's a lot of good information on your site, Liberty Blitzkrieg. You write some great stuff. Tell us about what's happening in Santa Cruz. They're cutting ties with banksters. You wrote about it. Tell us about it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So one of the commissioners, he basically wrote, he proposed to the rest of the board in Santa Cruz County that basically 5 banks, who's saying have essentially pled guilty. They're guilty of they're felons, and that Santa Cruz County should not do business with them anymore. And what was amazing is that the board actually agreed with him, and they voted to stop doing business. Now, what's interesting here is a lot of people on my Twitter stream and on my site who think this is great, sort of were skeptical, like, well, hopefully their finances are in good order, or what's going to happen when they need to raise debt, and I don't know the answers to that. Like, I don't know if they have other options, or if the too big to fail. It'll be interesting to see if the too big to fails somehow try to punish Santa Cruz in some way. We'll have to see, but certainly, I mean, this is one of the few areas I've actually seen where public commissioners are actually doing the right thing, and they have the courage to do it. Because for the most part, no one wants to step out of line. As you even mentioned, I think that's the problem with the Greenpeace guy. I mean, he's got a nice job, he's making money, he's in charge of this big, organization. What does he want to be a target? So for these people to do this is very brave, and it should be highlighted. And 3 years ago, I might say, well, this could be the start of a trend. I mean, unfortunately, I just see so much kind of cowardice out there that I'm not convinced of that. But you never know. It's a really good thing, though.
All right, let's move on. Another point you make on your site, another great story you're highlighting there, is exemptions from laws, cutting ties with bankers, criminals. Malaysia will be upgraded to a Tier 2 nation in order to include it in the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. That sounds pretty dodgy. Michael Krieger, tell us about it.
Yeah, it's crazy. And, I looked into it a little bit more since then, and it even gets worse and worse. So in a nutshell for your listeners, so Trafficking in Persons is a report that the State Department puts out every year, and they put it out about mid-June. Now, obviously, we're at the end of July, and there's no report out this year. And so the buzz in D.C. is essentially that the State Department is ready to upgrade Malaysia from Tier 3 to Tier 2 in this Trafficking in Persons report, which would be needed in order to include them in the way they need to be included in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Okay, well, here's the crazy part. Pretty much everybody that follows human trafficking understands that Malaysia has done absolutely nothing to warrant an increase in rankings. In fact, earlier this year, they found 139 mass graves of illegally trafficked people in Malaysia. They just found bodies everywhere. But beyond that, I looked in some other statistics. So an organization called the Global Slavery Index, which tracks modern slavery around the world, said that Malaysia has an estimated 140,000 modern slaves. There's an estimated 2 million people trafficked and tens of thousands of women forced into prostitution. So, I mean, Malaysia is an absolute basket case on human rights in human trafficking. But, the corporation, ruled by corporate law and these panels and protecting profits of multinational corporations at the expense of people worldwide is more important. And that's it. But we haven't seen Malaysia upgraded yet. It'll be interesting to see what happens. 160 House of Representative members have written a letter worried about this, and 17 senators. So we'll see what happens. But it's certainly disturbing.
Michael Krieger, you were in New York. You were working in finance. Now you live in Colorado. Colorado was recently listed as the #1 economy in the U.S. What's going on?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, these rankings, obviously, it's tough to say, how to rank a state economy. But one of the metrics in this particular ranking from last year that had Colorado #1 had to do with the increase in working age college graduates, working age people, and Colorado is leading the way in that. In fact, another think tank came out and showed that from 2000 to 2012, the increase in 25 to 34-year-old college grads in Colorado was up Denver specifically, was up 47%. It was the #3 city in America. So what you're seeing is a flood. You're seeing, and I believe this will probably continue throughout my lifetime. You're actually seeing, it's not just Colorado, it's other states in the center of the country. It's like Austin, it's Nashville. You're seeing people move in from the coast. It's like another mass migration, I believe, in the United States history. And I think we're still in the early stages of it. And personally, what I think is happening is it's sort of related to like how the organic food movement got going years ago, and now it's mainstream. It's a lifestyle choice. So, out here, you can work really hard and then on the weekends go camping. You could go skiing and snowboarding an hour away. You can you go hiking right out your back door. You go biking. It's a really good balance. And I think more and more, particularly young people, millennials have different priorities than older generations. They care about lifestyle. And lifestyle in Colorado is great. Although we've got enough people moving here, so.
Right. Well, there's a lot of mobility in the United States. People move around states all the time. Here in the UK, in London, the housing market is unaffordable by 95% of all new graduates, and there are no jobs unless you want to work for a big bank. But people never consider moving. They just say, well, if I'm not going to live in London, then I'm just going to starve to death. I don't understand that mentality. Why don't they just move?
Right. Yeah, no, that's interesting. In fact, a lot of people in New York kind of have that mentality. It's changing, but I mean, at least for me growing up, it was always like New York City is the center of the world. Like, how could I ever live anywhere else? But what I found on my road trip, and I know you interviewed me after that several years ago, what I found is the gap, let's say the culture gap, the food gap, the fun gap, whatever, is narrowing so considerably across the country that you'll go to like little towns even, college towns around America, and you'll be like, wow, I can't believe I can have such good food, or these art galleries, these cultural events. So whereas people used to think you needed to be in one of these coastal big cities to have culture, at this point you don't need that. Like, so you'll get a kick out of this. I went to a bagel place in Denver the other day. It was pretty good. The guy actually is making New York City tap water. So he's taken the mineral content specifically, and he's changing the water here to make it the exact mineral content so the bagels are better.
Well, that's the secret. You can't have a good bagel with a schmear if you're going to make a bagel, unless it has New York City water. That is obviously the truth. All right, we've got about 20 seconds left. The Republican National Convention is going to be there. Speaking about tourists and whatnot, we've only got about 20 seconds left. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm going to end with this. Donald Trump, people think he's a joke. Huffington Post is covering him in entertainment. I think he's extremely dangerous. I think, as Jeffrey Tucker said, he is the first manifestation we've seen, at least in my lifetime, of like a right-of-center fascist statist guy. And he's appealing to angst and energy. It's really disturbing. I think Trump could continue this momentum, unfortunately. And so I'd continue to watch out for him. The rest of them are just jokes, and so is he. But he came out of nowhere, so pay attention. All right, Michael Krieger, who is the creator and editor of Liberty Blitzkrieg, thanks for being on the Keiser Report. Thanks, Max. Always fun. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Michael Krieger of LibertyBlitzkrieg.com. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.